On September 19, 2012, the National Snow and Ice Data Center declared the annual sea ice minimum, with the lowest extent of Arctic sea ice ever seen in the modern record.
I would almost argue that we might be entering into a new climate state. What is causing us to lose more of that winter ice cover every summer? Is it that you have these feedback processes starting to kick in? I mean, some argue that the ice is very thin anyways, so that it melts out easier in the summertime as well.
The white stuff that you can see in the middle of the ocean here is the ice that's over 9 years old. As you go up into the bluer shades, the ice gets younger and younger. And starting, you can see the date here, we're still in the 1980s. You can see how that thick ice is being driven right out into the Atlantic Ocean. There's less and less of the old ice now. We're here still in the 1990s. And as that AO continues to drive all the thick ice out of the Arctic Ocean, you see that we're left with less and less of it. Getting up into the 2000s now, the Arctic is mostly filled with much younger ice. As we get right up to the present day practically, and here we are today. Basically, you see that there's hardly any of that thick ice left.
The volume of ice at the pole naturally goes up in the winter and down in the summer, but it's been declining over the last 30 years. It's now at the lowest level since records began. Estimates that the North Pole could be ice-free in summer in a few years contrast with the official view of the Met Office that the Arctic will not be completely free of ice before the summers of 2030. But it's the effect of losing all that white ice that matters. The polar ice cap acts as a giant parasol, reflecting sunlight back into the atmosphere in what's known as the albedo effect. 30 years ago, the ice looked like this. The Arctic ice covered 2% of the Earth's surface, reflecting most of the sun's rays. But half of that ice has now gone, and open water absorbs far more of the sun's energy.
The rays of the sun land on the bright white surface of the ice. Most of the energy is reflected back into space and the region stays cool. But when the ice retreats and melts, those rays fall on the darker surface of the ocean. That energy gets absorbed, warming the ocean, melting more ice. A vicious cycle then begins, what the scientists call positive feedback.
The graph on the top right there, what that talks about is Arctic sea ice volume. It shows us this pretty long-term trend here. That long-term trend is down.
A lot of focus has been on the area of the ice and how much there is, but what's also been happening is a thinning of the ice. And so it's becoming more vulnerable in two different ways. This year there's been indications of storms occurring, and storms start churning up the water. That churns up the ice and breaks it up, again makes it into smaller pieces and causes damage. So as you open it up and you have open water, which can bring heat to the surface by churning and mixing and everything else, you're presumably adding more energy to the atmosphere, and so you have more potential for storms. So this is a very interesting phenomenon that I think people haven't really thought much about.
There has been some research that suggests that storms have been more numerous and slightly more intense, and probably that's because the ice edge, as it moves northward, that ice edge is a big temperature discontinuity in the surface, and so just like storms like to ride along the Gulf Stream along the East Coast, they also like to ride along discontinuous temperature areas or big differences in temperature like we see at the ice edge.
Certainly the storm in early August helped to break up the ice in the Chukchi and East Siberian Sea. But yeah, would the ice have melted out anyways? Probably, because it was already pretty thin. And there was a lot of open water areas already between the ice floes. so the storm just sort of took it away really quickly. I think it would have melted out anyways, though.
The amount of sea ice that was lost this year compared to any year we can look at going back even a couple thousand years, there's really nothing like what we've seen happen this year. This loss of sea ice this summer is just such a stunning example of how the climate system is changing right before our very eyes. I mean, this is something that anybody can see. You don't have to be a scientist. And I like to hope that if there's a silver lining in all of this, that it's helping people to wake up and realize that this is a big problem. This is a real problem. It's happening now. It's not happening generations from now. And that we need to really start doing something about it.